A man entered a gas station on a February night in 1983 in a dangerous neighborhood of Corpus Christi, Texas. The clerk, Wanda Lopez, a poor single mother, was on edge when she called police.
Did he threaten you in any way? Did he have a knife pulled out?
Not yet.
Is it in his pocket? Hey, get a unit on the 17 to the Shamrock, 2602 South Padre. You got an armed robbery going down right now. Watch his beating the shit out of him.
The man leaped over the counter, stabbed Lopez in the left breast, and wrestled her to the ground, splattering blood across the walls. An eyewitness saw the man flee. 40 minutes later, police had their suspect, Carlos Deluna. The killer was another man, Deluna insisted, another Carlos Hernandez.
Maybe one day the truth will come out, and I'm hoping it will. Because if I end up getting executed for this purpose, I don't think it's right.
Deluna maintained his innocence at every opportunity, up until Texas executed him 6 years later by lethal injection. Prosecutors claimed Hernandez didn't exist, but while Deluna waited on death row, Hernandez was telling people about the gas station murder. He also used the same kind of knife that killed Lopez to attack other women, including Dina Ibanez.
Carlos was bragging about the other one that he did at the gas station because somebody else was arrested. He will call him his tocayo, and he will laugh about it because he got away with it and somebody else paying for something that he didn't do.
A tocayo is a person who shares your first name. Carlos Hernandez died in prison in 1999. Now a 430-page report published by Columbia Law School professor James Liebman and his students in a human rights law review details the murder. They found mistakes in the police investigation, problems with the eyewitness identification, missing information in the trial where Deluna was found guilty and in his appeals process. Meanwhile, Hernandez stayed free and went on to commit crime after crime. The study concludes that for the first time, evidence shows that a state has executed an apparently innocent person. Professor James Liebman and his students at Columbia Law School have spent 4.5 years reassembling this story. Carlos Deluna told people he was afraid to finger Carlos Hernandez for fear of retaliation. But if Carlos Hernandez was a criminal already well known to local law enforcement, convicted and charged with many violent crimes, why wasn't he a suspect already?
Well, that's hard to tell. We know, actually, that he was a suspect in this murder. The police reports that we uncovered 20 years later showed that the police had actually focused on him within 2 months of the crime. We found his rap sheet, Carlos Hernandez's rap sheet, in the district attorney's file dated in May. The trial was later in July, which was the first time that Carlos Deluna had said to the prosecutors that it was Carlos Hernandez, but they already knew about him, and the police had actually picked up the fact that Carlos Hernandez was confessing to the crime in the neighborhoods of Corpus Christi. A lot of people heard it, but the police heard it as well.
From the very beginning, it seems like things didn't add up. Was there ever any evidence connecting Carlos Deluna to the gas station and the killing of Wanda Lopez?
There was not a shred of forensic evidence in this case. Even though the crime scene was a very small, confined area that was just doused in blood because the victim was bleeding to death from her knife wound, there was not a drop of blood, not even a microscopic drop of blood on Carlos Deluna or his clothing. We know, because we found the photograph 20 years later, that the person who committed the crime left a footprint in blood, very deep blood, almost like stepping in mud. But Carlos Deluna's shoes didn't have a drop of blood. It's a lot of error in capital cases, and people said, well, it just shows the courts are up to the task of finding all that error. So we decided to look for cases where perhaps the courts weren't up to it. We looked for single eyewitness identifications, like this one where somebody went to got executed based on a single eyewitness identification. And one of the first cases we came to was this one, where Carlos Deluna said he'd seen another man commit the crime, but nobody had ever produced this other man, Carlos Hernandez. So we sent an investigator to Corpus Christi and said, spend a day and see if you can find Carlos Hernandez. And the second witness he talked to said, I know who Carlos Hernandez is. He's the uncle of my stepdaughter, and she's told me that he's confessed to this crime, killing the clerk at the Shamrock gas station some years ago. So that's how the investigation then unfolded for us as we traced down the history of Carlos Hernandez.
But it's been almost 23 years since the execution. Did some of the facts that you just laid out for us exist before Carlos Deluna went to the death chamber?
That's what's most frightening about this case. This is one of the most ordinary seeming cases, and at the time it seemed ordinary, open and shut, and nobody paid it a second thought, including the lawyers who represented Carlos Deluna on appeal, who told courts and told the governor at the time of clemency that Carlos Deluna was certainly guilty and made legal arguments on his behalf, but not the argument that he was innocent. So it took us to do this deep investigation 20-some years later to uncover what lay beneath the surface in this case and could very well lie beneath the surface in many other cases that look just like this, as just a kind of run-of-the-mill case where guilt has been established, and that's the end of it.
So you've called this run-of-the-mill, ordinary. What's the warning here for police departments, for prosecutors, for judges?
Well, the warning here is even if you've settled on a suspect, you should keep looking, especially if you hear that other people are taking the blame for it. And there's a broader message, too, that if we're going to use a penalty like the death penalty, that we have to take into consideration that the risk of executing an innocent person is real, and that's what this case has shown.